Hello and welcome to Salesforce Architecture Talk with Gaurav and Satya. This is the place for all architects, consultants, and developers in the Salesforce ecosystem. Hello, everyone. Good to be back on the next session. Here we are, episode number 7, and we got some exciting things happening. I hope you had a chance to listen to our last podcast about security architecture. If you haven't, do check out on our YouTube channel. And this is the next round of the security architecture. And in case you haven't seen us, haven't heard about us, check out on the Salesforce Architecture Talk YouTube channel. We have been doing all the CTA Prep sessions on different domains, and this is the second domain. And something exciting happening today. What's the latest excitement today, Satya?
Yeah, well, we have an exciting guest here today, Mitesh Mistry, who's joining us all the way from Thailand to talk us about security and deep dive into security. So let me introduce Mitesh real quickly. Mitesh is CTO Asia Pac at VRP Consulting. He has been in the Salesforce ecosystem for a long time and has experience that anybody in this ecosystem at the top of the tier. He is a CTA master coach. He has 15 years of experience across various Salesforce industries, worked for many partners, including IBM, Salesforce itself. You had a small stint at Salesforce as well, Mitesh. And prior to that, it was Accenture, right? So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Mitesh, to elaborate on your experience and tell us what we don't know.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Satya and Gaurav. Firstly, I think it's a great job which you guys do running this podcast. It's always nice to do things for the architecture community and help other people elevate their skill sets on the platforms. And obviously, as you guys are esteemed CCAs, your voices are voices of wisdom. So it's really a pleasure of mine as well and an honor to be part of your podcast. And thank you for inviting me to have a chat as well. So I'll give a quick introduction to myself. I mean, thank you very much for introducing me. As the guys mentioned, I've been in the Salesforce space now for 15 years. I started off my career, as maybe most of us, as a developer, and worked over the course of time to move towards becoming an enterprise architect. Now, that's been a journey that's allowed me to work through a different set of partners over the course of time, work through different customers that I've served, I guess starting off at the smaller scale and working up higher scale as you start to think more enterprise. But it's been a great journey. Sort of 3/4 of the way through that, I managed to achieve the Salesforce CTA credential, which I think was a really nice stepping stone to then help me take on more sort of senior enterprise architecture roles in the future. And that's basically now given me a chance to come out to Asia and looking beyond just what an architect does, trying to help shape and set up a practice also in this region. So it's been a really nice career journey, which I felt I've had.
That is super exciting because a lot of the CTAs, like when we start our journey, we are actually coaching to become a CXO, right? A CTO kind of role, which I think is really commendable that you're already doing that role for your organization. So I'm really intrigued when I meet fellow CTAs. I really want to understand their story on how you got into, like, if you have to go long back, how you got into technology. Were you always like a technology geek when you were a kid? How did you get into programming, I would say, and then Salesforce and then CTA? Do you mind walking us through your journey right from the start, right from when you were a kid?
Cool. So yeah, it's always nice to hear those stories. So I started off it's called Visual Studio at that time, I think many years ago. I started off doing some programming in that, building small application. I think I built some like cricket score calculator, so people who are umpires could then use this like automated thing to actually log 1 run, 2 run, 3 run, 4 run, etc. And built a little application for that that's years ago.
Wow.
And then I figured out from there that I did actually enjoy building things, and taking something which you can then actually complete and have as a tangible product. So I did one or two of those things when I was younger, and I used to enjoy our computing classes, which we had in school. And part of that involves some programming as well. And I realized actually I like doing it at that point. So that's what actually led me into to do computer science and software engineering at university. I thought this is kind of my calling and that's what I should get into. Now, the interesting story is that when I got to university and you realize that this is now going to be a career and you're not creating things creatively, but you're creating things as part of an assignment or a piece of work. Then reality hits you at that point, saying, well, I'm not so sure actually if I want to be doing this or sticking this as long term. And that honestly, that happened to me when I went to university. I was like, oh, I'm not so sure here. But then I kind of realized that being in this field is not just about writing code. It's about understanding a customer, being able to shape and scope up projects of work for them as well, and ultimately being able to deliver them some form of value. And that value doesn't come from simply knowing how to code. I think it also comes from being able to empathize with them, work with them, understand how they use systems, how can we solve their problems for them, and then relaying that to a development team to be able to coordinate them, either yourself or them, and say this is actually how certain things should get done. And I realized that I enjoyed the technical stuff too. So I said to myself at university that fine, wherever I start working, I need to make sure that the role is balanced, where yes, you're doing the tech stuff and learning that thing, but there should be enough customer interaction where you feel that connect one-on-one, that you're helping somebody out in the work you're doing. And that's basically helped me shape my career and guide me through the roles I've taken as well over the course of time. So when I started working at Deloitte. That was kind of heavy. I think it was heavy coding I felt at that time, not very much people interaction. And I realized that, fine, I'm going to have to move on and find somewhere where I can do much more of the non-technical work and balance it with the technical work too. So when I joined a smaller consulting firm, I realized that you have to be jack of all trades. You can't just sit there by your desk and say, I'll write code. It's okay. You have to be able to work with the customer one-on-one, understand the challenge, write up requirements, and then actually go and deliver them too. And that's when I realized that, this is actually what I like, where you get to do a little piece of everything over the course of time. And as I've grown in my career, I've basically followed that kind of ethos that fine, just take on roles which genuinely are letting you do a bit of everything. And then as you get more senior, which I'm sure you guys have had too, you start to want to take on more leadership things where you're no longer the doer in most of the cases, but you're the person kind of managing the piece of work being done. So I've tried to kind of wind myself into that as well.
No, I think you summarized the ethos of to CTA to a certain extent, because I feel like hearing to your story, you as a CTA were born when you were in uni, because it's like we are using a technology platform, whether it is Salesforce or anything else, to solve business problems, right? And that realization, for me, it actually happened very late, because I was very into coding at the beginning, and it took me a while to realize that. But for you, when I hear your story, you're like, you realize that pretty soon, which is great. But even CTAs, in a way, summarize that way, right? We are trying to solve a business problem, and it may be on Salesforce platform. The exam is very specific to Salesforce, but you can take those principles and apply it anywhere else, any platform. The things may differ a little bit, but in the end, the principles are the same. The architecture principles are going to be the same. So that's brilliant. I really, this is very inspiring, Mitesh.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the one thing more common I have just noticed now while your introduction was coming, we all have definitely we would aspire to become CTA. We became CTA. Now we are in that particular mode where we are helping community to become stronger architecture community, right? Architects community. And then you build scorecard for the umpires, which means you clearly had interest to cricket, or possibly still have cricket interest, and we all are.
I lost it after the World Cup finals.
Don't worry, it'll come back. It happened to me. I think it'll happen. So you will be back in the action by June next year in the World Cup.
Yeah. So you got into after uni. Did you go straight into Salesforce, or did you work into other technology platforms as well?
So I did an internship whilst at university between my third and fourth year. So I spent a year in US, lived in Denver, Colorado for a year.
Nice.
I was working they were Sun Microsystems back then, before they were bought by Oracle. So I was helping lab engineers configure their back-end systems that they use to support customers. So I was basically doing two things, really, just working very closely with them and helping get operating systems installed, disk drives configured in Sun machines to make sure that the engineers can then replicate customer environments in the Sun's internal labs. And that was a very cool and probably a very eye-opening role, because I realized that I enjoy helping people in what I do. And that whole human interaction, I really enjoyed. And being able to be like, fine, I'm going to sort this little problem out for you, and you guys manage it from there. And I think the other thing I would say is working overseas for a year at that age, amazing. Just getting to experience a totally different work culture. I think the one thing I've seen with the US is it's very free. You kind of you can kind of say what you want, and there's not so many rules about how you need to behave. I think in the workplace, so obviously some things will be there, but I felt it was quite nice and open. So it was nice to work out there. I then came back to the UK, finished off my degree, and then I joined Deloitte, and that's where I got introduced to Salesforce. Now, interestingly enough, it's kind of, I'm not going to say by accident, it was almost by accident. So I was working on a project, I was doing some Java development, writing unit tests for an application they're building for the media sector. And the guys asked me that, okay, we need somebody to do some Visualforce. And I was just like, well, I don't know what this is. Is this something I want to get into, not get into? Is it the next big thing? What's going on? So I said, fine, just take the leap of faith and do it. So I was building Apex and Visualforce for what was called Portals back then. And that was the beginning of my Salesforce journey. And I didn't know at that time that I'm going to end up sticking to this platform for the next 14, 15 years. But I'm very glad I did, because I've just found that from a career perspective, from an opportunities point of view, from the kind of people I've had a chance to meet, like you guys is a great example here. It's really worked out well, actually. And I'm really glad that I stuck to Salesforce and grew my career in this domain.
Yeah, interesting. And so you said 15 years ago, so that means almost 2008, 2009, isn't it? Wow, that is a long time. Yeah. I got into Salesforce, I think, around 2010, 2011. And I was also I also got in by accident. I was working on Java and C++ at the time. And my VP at the time comes to me and says, hey, there's this exciting cloud platform, Salesforce. And I was actually, before that, I used to work, I was writing an operating system, so almost at a C++ level. I'm like, I'm not going to build application software. I'm a hardcore computer science guy. Come on. But then I started researching it. Cloud was just becoming a thing at the time, right? 2010, 2011. So yeah, I'm so glad that you continued your journey, and and we get to meet and so on and so forth. So yeah, Gaurav?
Yeah. As in, I was about to say, it was a different kind of accident for me. As in, my brother was trying to apply for internship in Salesforce, and he said, there is this particular company, Salesforce. Shall I apply for internship or not? I was like, let me check it out. And I went to Google, and I was like, okay, that seems like pretty interesting company. And I signed up for a DevOps. I built up some objects and created some things. I was like, why do I want to create objects like this when I can just spin up a table under the hood in MySQL? I can just do everything quickly. That was my developer mindset in 2014. And then it was an accident that actually introduced me as well. So, and yeah, that's how it happens. So you just get in once and don't want to leave afterwards.
The low-code paradigm shift gets a lot of hardcore developers by shock. A lot of Java people who move to Salesforce ecosystem are like, hey, why are we doing this? Why is there a user interface for everything? Why do we write process builders and flows? Why not just write Apex? So there's always that friction. If you meet people that come from other technologies, you'll see that friction early on. But then later on, they realize the value of the platform, and so on and so forth. So at what point, Mitesh, did you... So, okay, let me ask you this. When did you first hear about CTA in that journey? And then at what point did you think, this is something that I want to do?
Okay, so I first heard about the CTA journey in 2010, 12 when I was working for Acumen Solutions. So we had a guy there, very, very good architect called Simon McVeigh. I think he was one of probably the first 10 CTAs to get through. I think he's that early in passing. And he was just amazing. The way he used to handle customers, the way he used to architect solutions at the company. I was like, wow, I want to be him in terms of how he approached things. So that's where I got introduced to it. Now, I didn't actually start studying for this probably until 2014, where I took a bit more interest. But even then, if you guys remember, Salesforce didn't have any trail mixes for CTA until 2016. So my study really started in 2016 when I joined Salesforce. Pretty much straight at that point, Salesforce has had their own internal program, which broke things down into domains, and you study one domain at a time. They call them badges. You have to pass them before you're becoming eligible to take mock exams for review board. And because the public trail mixes were there, I finally had content I could study in a structure and knew what I had to revise. So that's in essence when it began. I then took a review board in 2017 towards the end when I'd done all my domains and did mocks. Didn't get through the first time, and I think rightly so. And then I went again in 2018 and knocked it out of the park. So it was nice to obviously get it done whilst at Salesforce. It was good to be there. And I'd say one thing I'd say to anybody who's on the journey is treat it as a learning process for the journey. It's actually the journey is more important than the outcome which you get, because you feel yourself becoming a much stronger architect. You feel yourself being able to solve customer problems a lot better, and you feel yourself with a much bigger briefcase of tools than you would have ever had before. And that is way more important, I think, than the credential itself. I'm not devaluing the credential, but I'm saying that the focus on the journey. I see a lot of people who just think, fine, I've completed my application system architect. Now I'm okay. I go forward for board. You couldn't be further away from the truth. You have to really dive deep into all the different areas, learn the stuff really well. And then you are the right candidate to think about taking mocks and go forward for board.
Yeah.
Very rightly said. Very rightly said. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what we call it out in our podcast as well, that you need to look at CTA as a process to become better architect. You get through these particular learning curves and domains, and I think it's a journey which is more important than the outcome. If it's happened, it happens. It doesn't. Don't be sad about it.
Yeah,
cool.
and I think there is a step when you do decide to become a CTA. You need to very thoroughly introspect and understand why are you doing it, right? Your why, it becomes a key anchor for you during your journey as well. So define your why before you even go too deep into it, because that is where you will anchor back to any time you're like, life happens, right? So things happen, and then if you want to come back to it, that why becomes very important. Let me ask you this, Mitesh, because this is something that we ask a lot of candidates: is what was your why? Like you briefly mentioned it in just now, but what was that why? What was that anchor for you when you're going through that journey, and when you felt like, oh, maybe I'm not? Did you ever get a feeling that maybe I'm not cut off for this? And did you ever get demotivated and came back to this?
Yeah, so I'd say when you look at other people, when you're young and you look at other people who are CTAs, you just think, wow, there's actually a lot to aspire to here, because you hear of projects that they've solved or they've worked on larger enterprise customers and how they've scoped the architecture for them. And you're like, I haven't done that really, can I actually do it if I'm put in those situations? And the lesson I learned from that is if you learn the stuff, if you learn the content, then yes, you are equipped to then tackle those kind of problems. And what I've found is no matter how big a challenge might be, you break it down to the smaller pieces, solve the smaller pieces and work your way up. It has to be done with that approach. Otherwise, you bamboozle yourself and just say, you say to yourself, I can't do it, when actually you can. If you just took the time to break it down and solve things chunk at a time. So you asked me about my whys of becoming CTA. I think one of the biggest drivers for me was, in any industry that you're in, you want something to be there that can show you as an expert in that domain. So if you imagine like accounting, they have the ACCA qualifications. Other industries, they have some other qualification, which is like, a topmost thing, which is there. And for Salesforce, this is the topmost one. I mean, there is nothing bigger than this to try and achieve in the Salesforce space. And I thought, look, if I'm going to be committing my career to this domain, at least make an effort to go towards this. Because in any case, I was doing architecture work. It totally made sense to push myself in that direction. And if learning all the content is going to make me much better at my day job, then let me go down that route and make myself better. So that for me, I would say was the why. And then seeing other people who are CTAs, I just thought, wow, if they're able to solve problems like this and this is what they know, then I have to know this. So those things kind of pulled me towards the journey of becoming CTA. And I think a why for a lot of people is probably going to be monetary as well. It wasn't for me initially because I had no idea what the compensations and so on are once you become CTA. But I can certainly say that whilst the numbers are still under the 500s, you probably have a good chance to knock off a good salary. Whilst there's not 10,000 CTAs out there. So if that's a motivator for anyone, that would be, I would think.
It's not a bad motivation, in my opinion. Like, you should definitely have a monetary thing as your motivation, but that shouldn't be the only motivation.
Exactly.
Right? That could be one of the factors that you consider, right? So,
Yeah. And I have seen some people, they think, oh, will it be worth my time to go to this particular track? Will I get that kind of monetary benefit after 1 to 2 years of investment? Probably okay angle to look at, as in if you're technically investing a lot of your time, you need to assess all the factors from your personal life and from your other growth opportunities. But that cannot be single motivation. So
that's true.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think that's good, as in having an inspiration from your other senior leaders to basically get to this particular track. You joined Salesforce to have a structured approach, and then is that how you basically worked out? And how long did you spend in Salesforce working towards CTA, and how it happened?
Okay, so I started the journey properly. Now, I would say properly. I started it in about April, May 2016. And I went to sit my first board at the end of 2018. So it involved basically 12 months, I would say, of domain preparation. So learning each domain, making my own revision notes, making sure I understand the content well, sitting the internal Salesforce badges. And then beginning I think it was 5 to 6 months of mocks, doing mock exams and becoming board ready. So that process, I think, took about 16 months to get ready for the first board attempt, from starting all that learnings. And then when I didn't get through, then I had to give myself another 6 months. And those 6 months were really key in making sure that any knowledge gaps I had, I'd fully closed off. And I was making sure that second time round, there's no stone left unturned when going into the board. And this is something I tell anybody I speak to about CCA, that fine, do not leave any area open. Just don't. Because when the I don't want to say the judges are like dogs, but in some ways, some of them can be, right? And if they sniff out a little weakness that I'm not sure this guy knows this, then it makes for a fun questioning to dive into that little gap and see if somebody knows this or not. So my advice to everyone is, while you have the time to revise, don't be lazy and skimp on a certain area thinking it's not going to come up. No, just do everything, because anything can come up from anywhere, and especially that you know everything very well. So that's the biggest thing I learned. So second time round, way more prepared. My approach to presentation was much more refined as well. I was very clear what things are PowerPoint, what things are going to be paper. We had the in-person boards at the time.
Right.
Yeah, the flip charts. And I just felt way more comfortable presenting the second time round. And I think the other thing I would say is a lot of it's on the day. We speak a lot about the preparation, but you can prepare all you want. Sometimes if it's not your day, it's not your day. And if it is your day, it is your day. So second time round, I think it was my day. I was able to kind of understand what the case study was about. I felt a connection with it and, solved it and presented that. So this is something I'd say to people who don't get through, let's say, the first time. Don't be disheartened. Sometimes luck plays a part as well. And, if just things didn't gel on that day. I mean, I was feeling sick that first time as well. So it was multiple factors which were not really playing in my favor. So yeah, just don't give up. Go again. You might have a better day next time.
That is so true. That is so true. The day factor, and all you can do a lot to optimize on the day as well, right? Like get like almost stop studying one day
Yeah.
before. Like, don't do it, don't even touch. Even though it is counterintuitive to do that, you're so inclined to open up that notes and go through them again. Don't do it one day before the exam, right?
I know.
Yeah.
It reminded me 2020. It is exactly how it happened. And you would imagine my coach told me that, okay, 1 week before, just stop everything. Just go and watch movie. Go out with your family. I'm like, I can't do that. I can't just stop everything. The one things I've been preparing for like months. But yeah, that
It's hard
cutoff
to
is
do.
important. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. All right. I think that's good. So awesome journey. I think I think
Inspirational, yeah.
having a structured path, going through the whole track, having the support and trying it hard again after failure. That's definitely inspirational, where a lot of candidates will face that particular challenge, right? And, sharing that perspective is very important. And we heard you are running your CTA Academy. Do you wanna what's it all about? Are you taking in candidates? Are you helping? How are you helping other candidates there?
Cool. So I launched the academy quite a few years ago, but I think whilst I was still forming content for it, I kept a very low profile. So probably most people haven't heard about it until this year. So in April this year, I launched the website, and ever since then, I've had a flurry of candidates coming in asking about the academy, wanting to join. So I've based it on the principles that I believe in, which is deep domain learning. So the way the academy works is that there are 10 domains of architecture that you get assessed in. The revision part is down to you. So I'm not here to teach architecture. If you have a question, I'll answer the question, but it's not my job to join long hours teaching that. That's not what I'm here to do. But what I do is that when people have questions, they're learning something and they don't understand, then they come to me and we answer those questions. But one of the key things I have is that per domain, there's a case study which you have to sit, which is specific for that domain. And that makes sure that for me as a coach, that you have done your work, done your revision, that you understand that domain really well. And for you as a candidate, it gives you a chance to present 10 times over. Because sometimes we take for granted that people will probably have done 100 client presentations and they'll be okay. Suddenly when they do a presentation with you, you realize that actually maybe they need a bit more practice. So doing that 10 times over, make sure that they're getting into a pattern for being able to explain technical concepts in a bit more simpler way to an audience who can then listen and understand. And by making you present on a domain, I think that's a really great way of spotting if you don't know something, and also making sure that you're confident in what you know. Because written exams, you can write stuff, it's okay. But when you have to stand and talk, it's a different ballgame. So you have to know your things at that point. So 10 times over, we do that. And only once you pass those 10 domains are you allowed to then take mock exams. So I then take candidates through a series of 6 mock exams. Most of them I've written, apart from the world famous Megaprint, which I think is a great one. So I brought that into my academy, saying we'll do that one too. Nice. And yeah, once you're ready, you've gone through all that. We have 2 things which we have. I coach people for the review board evaluation to just train them on how can you present in an hour and what kind of artifacts to give. And the same thing for the final review board too. Because one of the problems that I faced in my time was just not knowing what to say per slide, or what slides do you need. Like if you guys go back to like 2017, 2016, there was nothing there which told you what slides to present. There was no candidate videos. No one shared anything at that point. I think everyone was quite, I'm not going to say secretive, but I think a lot of people went on their own in terms of moving forward. So I really struggled with having a template. I just didn't know, like, what should my 10 slides be? What needs to be on the slides? Like, what is a judge going to check for that needs to be there? And it was only when I went the second time round that I really understood that, fine, these 10 things have to be on these slides to make sure that you're covering off the right content. So I help candidates there by giving them that thing. They don't have to use what I give. It's more of like a, take this and tailor it to what works better for you. But I think it helps candidates have a structure. So at least they know what to knock off and close off. So we do that. We then assess if they're board ready or not. And these guys go forward for review board evaluation. And then finally for the review board too. I think where I might differ to other academies is my focus is more on the learning aspect and the domain learning area. Giving, it's almost like 10 to 12 months where you're just doing that. So for some people, when they join my academy, they say that I want to do it in 4 months. I'm just like, it's not going to happen, guys. Like, seriously, just give it 10. Do this well, give it 10, get it done once and for all. And I encourage everyone to say at that point, please make your own revision notes. Because when you get through to the actual mock exam preparation, that really intense 4 or 5 months before board, you don't want to be opening Trailhead again. You just want to be reading your notes, and that's it. And then going forward. So that's how it's structured. That's how it's run. It's kind of mirrors to a certain degree how Salesforce run their own one. But I think that formula works, and that's why I've kind of stuck to that in what I've got. So I've got I think it's 14 people now in the academy. So it's nice. Kind of grown from strength to strength this year. And I've got quite a few people coming into the pipeline for next year. So I've got a few decisions to make for next year as to what to do and how to run things.
Beautiful. No, I think that's very impressive. Very impressive. And the way you have structured it, I would definitely acknowledge the fact that it's that's supposed to work. That's the formula I would say it is going to help, because domains are the one thing which you want to solve first and understand them properly, and then you get through the whole mock scenario, and I think beautifully done. And how long this one candidate go through, as in how many weeks or months one candidate spend in your academy?
Okay, so I think the rough going rate is going to be 18 months. So I've got people who are doing the domain learnings now. Before, I had a few candidates who are doing just the mock exams, and those people are some of the early guys that I brought on. So they wanted to go down that route where they didn't want to do the domain learning, but just do the mock exams. So for them, they're finally going forward for boards this year. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed as to what their outcome is. But for your question, I would say roughly anywhere between 18 months and 2 years is the kind of going rate if you are doing the full domain preparation and board readiness too.
Very nice. Very nice. That's a long time for you to be involved as well and help the candidate. Candidate has to anyway get through, but you are right there from the start of the journey, right? So very long time.
Yeah, and I think it helps because it lets me see their growth. They can see their own growth too. And this is the one reason I did it, because I just wanted to make sure that no one is missing out or skipping on the learning part. And I just desperately want to make sure that's done, because it's really hard when you're a judge for somebody and you're judging their mock exams. In the 40 minutes which you're judging, you don't always have the time to grill every area. And sometimes this just doesn't come up. So the last thing I'd want is for candidates to go to the board and then afterwards tell me that, hey, look, I didn't even know this topic was there. So my intention is that should never happen. At least everything from a knowledge perspective should be there before we do mocks and move forward.
Awesome. That's brilliant. Yeah. I think you touched upon a very important point as well, is like you give them the learnings, you give them the coaching, and they need to then take their notes and apply it based on their style. This is a very important point because, and this is something that Gaurav and I also talk about in our podcast, is no two CTAs are the same. No two, you can give two CTAs the same scenario. They may come up with a different solution, which may both be right. It is catered to more towards your own style of presentation, your own style of learning. So I think that is a key element that you mentioned here, is like, take these learnings, apply your own notes to it, and then come up with your own style when you appear the board. So that's very important.
Yeah, definitely. All right. That's good. I think let's now go into a little bit deeper into one particular domain which we wanted to go into.
Let's talk security.
Security. So awesome journey, and congratulations for spinning up this whole academy over the years, and you're doing great efforts to bring more candidates to become CTA, and really keep it up and keep it moving.
Thank you.
And you've been putting a lot of content on LinkedIn. I've been a follower of your content. It is really great work. One post that you did on security was around role hierarchy and what happens under the hood. When I read that post, I was like, we need to get Mitesh on the pod. Let's talk. He's deep into security, right? So like, do you want to talk about a little bit about that post, and also about the whole role hierarchy in Salesforce, because that's very, very specific to Salesforce platform, right? I feel like a lot of people are confused about how to model the role hierarchy and what actually
Oh.
happens behind the scenes. I know a lot of folks who have been working on the platform are really shallow on this topic. So do you want to expand on that post a little bit?
Sure. I think it's a really interesting thing to know and learn. And let me talk through how Salesforce stores roles, role hierarchy, and some of the sharing setups too underneath the hood. So let me talk through it. So in essence, if you want to go one screen, perfect. In essence, we've got three types of groups that get formed when you're configuring role hierarchy. So you have your role group, which consists of people who belong to the role and also people who are above them in the role hierarchy. You have another type of group, which is called role and subordinates group, which is basically people who are part of the role, people who are above that role, and all the people who are subordinates of that role too. And the last one is the role and internal subordinates. So as you are aware, we have internal users who normally are the ones who are setting up partner users, which means they are going to be sitting above a partner user in the role hierarchy, BU CC plus or BU partner, so external users. So the role and subordinates group is basically saying, fine, users of that role, people above that role in the role hierarchy, and the internal users who are also then below the role in the role hierarchy. So that's what the three groups that get formed inside of Salesforce. Now, within those three groups, we have the notion of direct members and indirect members as well. And let me talk through kind of for each type, who becomes direct members, who becomes indirect members. So if you take the role group, the basic one, so then obviously people who belong to that role are the direct members. The indirect members are the ones who inherit access from the direct members. So in this case, the indirect member in a role group is going to be people who are above that role in the role hierarchy. So that's how it's split up. If we take the next one, the role and subordinates group, then the direct members are people who belong to that role, and also people who are belonging to subordinate roles, so below that role in the role hierarchy. These are all the direct members, and the indirect ones are the ones above, again, so that concept is the same. And the same principle applies to role and the internal subordinates group as well, where direct members are people who belong to that role, and people who belong to any internal subordinate roles, so below that particular role. And above that role in the role hierarchy, they become the indirect members because they're inheriting access. So that's in essence how it's structured behind the scenes with those three particular groups. What I'll say here is that the actual, where are we storing in Salesforce, who is part of what role, okay? That's stored in the group member table. So we'll have group tables, which is going to, so let's take a role that we create. Let's say a CEO role as an example. The CEO role is going to probably end up having three group records in Salesforce. So one is going to be called role group, one will be called role and subordinates group, and one will be role and internal subordinates group, which has to get created. And then when you are creating group member table, that'll then basically say who are the users that are part of that group or that role, and then also who are the other members who have access because of that role too. And those are the people that basically end up becoming part of the group member table. So one slide I do want to talk through, if you go to the next page. So I don't want to go through this in too much depth, but what I'll say is when you guys have time, have a read through this particular slide. What it explains is if you have 4 users who are parts of 4 different roles, how does Salesforce actually structure and store them under the hood? And then who in essence becomes part of a group because they're a group member, and are they direct or indirect? So I'll encourage you guys to give this slide a little read afterwards to understand how is it structured and what do they fall into as part of the group membership. But the final slide is something I do want to touch upon, because this is probably a question a lot of people have is, fine, it's all fine and well Salesforce storing it this way, but if we want to be able to then understand how does Salesforce actually query this data to determine what record to show an individual, how is that done? And that's probably the most important question to ask. So let me just speak through this. When you guys have a look at the example, it'll come to life. But in essence, I do want to mention this from a steps perspective. So let's say you have a user. They want to access a particular record on an account. What are the first things that are going to happen? So the very first step that Salesforce does is it says, does the user have profile or permission set access to that particular object or not? That's the very first thing. Okay, so let's say they want to access an account record. Do they have view or edit? What do they have at that point that they can access the object?
This
And
is
then
a
the
very
second
important
thing,
point, right? This is a very important point. I mean, I've been asked this question so many times, like, your role hierarchy and your record sharing only applies if you have the CRUD permissions. So if you don't have view, then you're not going to see. Doesn't matter where you are in the role hierarchy, you're not going to see account records really. So that's very important. Yeah. Sorry to
cool.
interrupt. Yeah.
That's okay. And then the next thing that Salesforce needs to check is fine. So do you have view all, modify all, or not? Because if you have those, then pretty much you can see everything. So we don't need to go further if that is the case. If that's not the case, we do need to go further. So let's see what Salesforce does. So it's going to now say, fine, let's suppose they had view access on the object, so they can at least read records. The next thing we do is we say, fine, for the actual object itself, what is the org by default? Is it a public read only or public read write? The reason why this check is also important is because if suppose it was public read write, okay, and you had view access via your permission setter profile to that particular object, Salesforce doesn't really need to go digging into the share tables at that point because it's got enough to tell it that fine, the user can see that record. So just make it visible to them. Likewise, if it was public read only and they'd got view profile access, I think it's okay. They only want to view. They got public read only on the record. Just show it. Job done. There's no need to go further. Suppose that's not the case, and we have to check whether or not the user can access or not. Then we have to go further down into step 3, where we're saying in the account share table, is there a row there or not that has got a row where the user or group ID, so for each object in Salesforce, a share table is maintained for them, where the org by default is not set to public read write. The share table has to be there. And in here, we're then saying, fine, for that particular user's user ID, is there a row in the account share table or not, where the user or group ID is that particular user ID? Mm-hmm. Now, this may or may not be there, is one point I'll say. So there may be instances where that person's user ID is not there in the account share table. You have to go further now. So this is where these group member tables start to really come into effect. So what we do here is we have to go at the group member table and we say, right, are there any groups that this user belongs to because of either Salesforce's public groups or because of the whole role hierarchy configuration, which would result in that row of data being granted access to that group that the user might belong to. So this is what step 4 is doing here. It's saying, fine, look at the groups that this person's part of. Look at the role hierarchy this person's part of. Not just the role, but also the role and subordinate groups as well. See which ones this user ID is listed in. To see, right, they're part of these particular role and internal subordinate groups, etc. Are they listed there as a user or group ID in the account share table? That particular role group, role internal subordinates group, role and subordinates group. And if the user is part of any of those, then whatever the most permissive access is, so is it like granting them write or is it granting them read? If it's write, you grant them write then, and let the user have write access to that particular record. We basically grant the most permissive access out of those. So this is the steps that Salesforce goes down to basically figure out, can somebody access a record or not? And I think this is something which, unless you've had to read this, you wouldn't probably come across or think about. But it's really nice to know that this is kind of how Salesforce is structured. So when people start to think about performance impacts, like you probably heard people say that if objects don't need to be marked as private, then don't mark it as private. And the reason is because you want to get performance gains, because obviously each of these steps here, especially when you get down to 3 and 4, those are database operations where you have to do a bit of a table scan, do a read operation to find a matching row or not. And if you can avoid Salesforce having to go down to step 3 or 4, then you'll obviously get some performance gains on records that you're returning back to the user. So I always say to people that when you're designing your security and sharing model, it's not good enough to make everything publicly read write. That's, again, not my thing. It's also not good to make everything private either. I think you have to balance it based on what does the user need to be able to see, what is your confidential data, and then based on that, have a good blend and harmony of the objects which you need to mark as private and public, so that you've got the kind of optimal structure put in place for record access.
Absolutely, yeah. I think this is a very key learning here. Unless you understand what happens behind the scenes, it's very hard to know what those performance impacts are, right? If you change the org by default on an object, this is an asynchronous process. Salesforce does this behind the scenes for you, and the actual access is done at runtime. So the query happens at runtime to these group and group maintenance tables, but the calculation on which group you're part of happens behind the scenes, right? That's why when you change the awkward default, it takes a while for you to actually, you get an email afterwards saying, okay, the calculations are now done, which means the tables are now established. And anytime you run a query or you run a report or you click on a list view, that's when the steps that Mitesh mentioned happen behind the scenes to give you access to the records. So very, very nicely explained, Mitesh. It took me a few times to go through that paper, record sharing under the hood, to get my head wrapped around this whole thing, right? That's a very highly recommended paper that every Salesforce architect should go through. Not once, but until you understand that what happens behind the scenes, right?
And I want to make a point. I want to make a really important point here too. So I think as a lot of us have grown our careers in the Salesforce space, what I've seen a lot of junior people do, kind of probably unfortunately is the word I'll use here, is that people worry about this thing in the very end. So a lot of projects that I've seen, you kind of basically you build all your things which you want to build. People are always testing as admins. This is another big issue as well. So when developers write stuff, no one bothers doing login as this, right? You go straight in as your user and it works, functionality works okay. It's only at the end when actually you have to think about a user and what they can access. Then people start to be like, have we gone inside of the sharing model or not? And all of a sudden you have people scurrying around on the sharing settings page being like, fine, let's mark everything as what it should be marked as. So one very important point, which is something which all of us as CTAs know because we're trained to do this, but it's something which, as for the ecosystem as a whole, I'd like to say this, especially the junior guys who are new to the platform. When you're designing your data model, please design your sharing hand in hand at the same time. So when you're thinking of the objects which you're going to bring in, think about two things as a minimum. So number one, who's going to own the records? Majority of the time, who will own it? And then secondly, what should be the org-wide default that we set for that object kicking off? It's really important because at least you put that in place. And when you're doing your developer testing, so you're logging in as a dev who's built some functionality, you want to test it works for a user, log in as that user. Just that is one thing you should do. Log in as that user. And if there's many, log in as 2 or 3, but at least do that just to make sure that the sharing settings have been applied correctly, can see that data. They're not able to do too much or too less and do those checks. And that makes life easy for the QAs because you've done one round. By the time it gets to QAs, they'll do that test anyways, but at least you've taken the liberty to do something for them before it goes across. So that's something I would recommend to anyone who's building.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I have seen so many programs failing to do that, where they get through the whole build, do internal testing, developer level testing with the admin user. In the demo also, they sometimes go through the admin user instead of going to a persona-based testing. And then in the end, when they go into the third-party testing, let's say in SIT, then things breaks down and then where are the personas? How many personas we are dealing with? So many scary stories. I think it's something definitely first thing to look at with the data model. So very well said.
Yeah, security has been, in most scenarios has been an afterthought. And this is record level sharing as well, right? There are a lot of other security aspects. So we covered this point in our talk, Mitesh, in terms of what are the things you need to consider when you do the data model. As you mentioned, have your awkward defaults defined, have your ownership defined, define your relationships, whether it's a lookup versus master detail, because that also defines a little bit of sharing for you. Whether it's a large LDV object, because that then the selectivity comes into place. The thresholds come into place, right? As well, if it's an LDV. So you got to have all these things in place when you define your data model. So very rightly said, very rightly explained. And you also mentioned so many anti-patterns here, right, when it comes to security. So, yeah.
I think you touched a little bit on this particular domain in terms of security, you should look at the first thing. But what all different when you were going through the prep in the whole security domain, what was the hardest thing which was there in your preparation around security? I would say, what was so difficult for you to learn and say, okay, yeah, this is how it works.
Okay, so I think from my side, the learning part was okay. So when I read the Salesforce papers, the concepts which were there made sense. The different features that you have. So for example, the setting up of org-wide defaults, the different types of sharing rules which you can do, the owner-based sharing, criteria-based sharing, and also the kind of sharing rules that you can set up for accounts. And when doing the account one, it lets you the opportunity, case, and contact, etc. So those things, once I knew them, it was okay. That's fine. These are my options for doing the sharing setup. Learning it is one thing, applying it is another. And when you start to do the CTA case studies, when you start to apply those learnings and trying to actually decide what the appropriate org-wide default should be, that requires practice, honestly does. And the more and more scenarios you do, which are different, because each one will have some different visibility need. Some will want some things to become public, some will want some things to become private, some things you have to, share using sharing rules. And you get some really edge cases where you have one specific bullet point in the case study, which means that either you have to totally rewrite your sharing for one object and make it crazy, or you have to use something custom and say, right, we'll have to do LWC and have an Apex without sharing and just build a custom component to sort this piece of data out. In my board, that came up where one bullet point would have made me really have to rehash a part of my data model. I was just like, I can't afford to do this. It's going to mess my solution. So I said, fine, for this one piece, build an LWC, Apex without sharing, job done. No questions asked. I think they're happy with that particular answer. So that requires a bit of practice, knowing and spotting certain patterns, being like, fine, this kind of requirement seems to suggest that it's going to be this data needs to be shown to everyone. In this case, let's make sure it's public read only. Now, being able to notice patterns, I think that's a really important part of your CTA prep, where you see this is similar to this, so therefore solutions this. I'll give one example as well, which has come up. So sometimes, let's say you're like an education firm who publish courses, okay? And you're using a course object to store details about that course. Now, some courses are ready, so they should be advertised on your website. Other courses are not ready. They're kind of being worked in the back burner. But as a starting point, you thought you'd use the same object to store all of it because in essence, it made sense when you're designing. For that kind of thing, it starts to become a real challenge because you got customer community users, so just CC, who need access to a subset of these records. And then you have internal users who should see everything. Like, how the hell do you balance that? In Salesforce, it's a problem. So that kind of thing, the easiest way I looked at it was just have two custom objects. You have one object which contains your unpublished courses and one custom object that you publish courses. It just makes the sharing so much easier because your published courses, public read only for your internal and external org by default. Internally, you can then control who can access the unpublished courses. And that's not visible via profile, permission set, etc. to the external people. So you can solve those problems that way. So this is just one small example. But for people doing CTA prep, look out for those examples because those are what help you on the board. You get to the board, you're not thinking about, oh crap, what is this how will I solve this? This how will I solve should go. It should be a case of, actually, in my briefcase, I have 5 solving methods here. Which one does it match up to? It looks like it's this one. Let me give that as my solution. And that's what the mock preparation is all about. Just making sure that you know the different approaches you can use to solve a certain sharing problem.
Correct. More practice you have, more scenarios you've seen, you can see it via your experience or by solving mock problems, right? So
exactly.
That's exactly right. That's awesome. I think maybe we should touch a little bit on that angle also, as in when we were on the journey, then we were told, okay, CTA exam is not an exam for. Not the exam only for people who are coming from technical background. That basically, if you have the relevant experience from business perspective also and have good enough details knowledge, then you can just get to this particular path as well. So, what sort of feedback or guidance you would have for the candidates who are maybe less hands-on on the platform, but they still want to get on the journey?
Okay. So at Salesforce, I saw quite a few people who hadn't done much Salesforce at all. So they'd come from Oracle, Microsoft, other companies, but they're still able to crack the exam in 2 years, 3 years, etc., and get through. But what they will not say is that in their own time, they went into Salesforce, they did the configurations, they did the flows, they did the practice in the org to make sure they fully grasp how things work. And my honest take on it is you do have to go into the platform and do things. And I'm not saying do things for 10 years and that's your only thing. No, that's not my point. My point is that to a certain extent, you do have to get hands-on so that at least in your subconscious mind or whatever, you have an understanding of what you've seen. It's like, okay, I saw these screens. I saw these 5 options on the screen. So if I have to think about flows, I saw that before, so I know it can do A, B, and C. Building that as memory in your head, I think, is extremely important. And likewise, the same thing applies to sharing, like setting up sharing and just seeing, fine, if I try to view the record, can I see it or not? What are the different options I have? Because for different objects, you've got different sharing options, or by default options too, which you can use. So once you do that a few times and see those options, they become memory in your head. And that helps you moving forward. So what I'll tell candidates is you don't need 10 years of doing Salesforce. Don't think so. But if you're more newer to the platform, then do spend the time going in and building a few things out in the Salesforce org, understanding the automations and also the declarative general stuff to make sure that you know how things work. You don't have to be an Apex and Lightning WizKid. It's not required, but understand where flows end. That's important. So understand where a declarative takes you to, what's the max I can push it to, and what's the tipping point when I should move into a programmatic approach. And the same thing applies from a simplicity point of view as well. So I think there's a big motion out there I've seen in the community of people trying to advocate flows for everything. But I look at it from a pragmatic point of view as well. Building an extremely complex flow versus building something in 15 lines of Apex code, do the 15 lines of Apex code and get it done. I think that's a much simpler, more maintainable solution than it is to build an overly complicated flow, lots of steps, and having somebody new then come in later to review that and be like, oh man, I don't know, how does this work? Your code might have been simpler at that point. So there's always these trade-offs to be made when you're building things.
Try doing recursion for loop in flow and see if the complexity it will go into. That's a problematic area, I would say. So that's definitely I think you're definitely rightly said. You got to find out the tipping point when configuration will not really work or will not really be maintainable. They might work, but you got to find out the alternative. Definitely.
Yeah, it's again a very important point. Pros and cons. Every approach has pros and cons. As a CTA, at the board or as an architect working on an actual implementation, you have to make those design choices or architecture choices every day. How do you make those choices? And not every choice is going to be the wrong one or the right one. You have to make that choice based on your scenario, your situation, right? That's very, very important to do in the exam as well as overall as a Salesforce architect. For security, there are certain very peculiar things, and we mentioned some of them, like the role hierarchy is very, very peculiar to Salesforce. Are there any other gotchas or anything who's preparing for this exam they need to know about it? Are there some things that take a little while for people to understand and they should double click on it more than anything other things?
Okay, so there's a few I think which I've only used Salesforce, so it's kind of hard for me to say how does it compare to other platforms that have Salesforce. But from a Salesforce point of view, I'll definitely speak. So I think record ownership is one thing that catches people out. So when you're doing large-scale data migrations, and secondly, when you're doing integrations, like let's say nightly integrations with loads of data being pushed across into the Salesforce platform, I think sometimes people forget to think about ownership as to who should actually own those records of data. One or two things is likely going to happen. You're either going to leave it in the hands of an integration user or a data migration user that was there and let them own the records. But in that position, you then have to think, where should they sit in the role hierarchy to make sure that people who should have access to those records can access them? And we're not introducing like a performance bottleneck in the future too. And what I normally try to advise is, I try to tell people that if you're going to have volume records coming in, data migration or by integration, just see if you can split them out across a group of users. If you got 10 people, let's say you typically own these records, whether it's via a round robin method, is there any particular way where we can say, fine, we go split up who these records actually get owned by? And I think doing that is something which can really help in the Salesforce platform too. The kind of impact that you get if you don't do these, you can start to end up with things like record locks, where you've got more than 10,000 records of an object owned by a particular user. You're trying to do something. You're trying to make a change to the share tables, for example, move the user at a different one in the role hierarchy.
Yeah.
Salesforce is going to have a bit of a hard time trying to recalculate the share tables when there's so many records to do it for. So that's one problem that we see. Other problem I want to mention as well is, and this relates back to sharing, is when you got lookup skew. So you got more than 10,000 child records tied to the same parent. Now, let's say you're then going around and doing some kind of bulk API load, and those records you have are split across 10 different files, and they're all coming up together. You're going to have a record lock because Salesforce takes file 1. File 2 comes in, and Salesforce is going to say, actually, hang on, I've got a lock on this record in file 1, so I cannot push this one in. So then you have to think about grouping your records together to say, fine, let's try and cut it under 10K if we can. Split it across multiple parents, so you maybe have max 10K of those child records per parent if possible. And if you can't do that, at least do the one thing that in your bulk API bringing the data in, you split the data across, you move the data for one parent into one file. So at least it's grouped together, finish off the update, take the next file. So those are some techniques which become important. You don't, in these low volume cases, we don't normally think about, but when you start dealing enterprise data, these techniques become extremely important to do.
Yeah, and data, whoever has done data migration knows these problems exist.
Yeah.
And this is also one of those things that comes very late in your project, right? You have rolled out the project, now you're trying to do data migration, your production go live is on Monday, and you're trying to do data migration on Saturday, and you start to see all these issues and you don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So very important to keep these things in mind. I think we've touched upon this. I feel like, but are there any specific security anti-patterns, Mitesh, that you have seen people do? And if you have to give one security best practice for everybody listening, what would that be?
Okay, so I think I've probably mentioned a little bit earlier about people dealing with sharing and security at the very end, where everything is left as read write, and you don't worry about it. You then come at the very end to your project and be like, how was you able to do this? Well, you didn't set these things up properly. That number one has to be done first. Okay. I'd also say that in some examples, I've seen people who they overly rely on Apex and SQL to determine what a user can see and do. Because you've gone down a custom route, and let's say you've got Lightning Web Components as your screens, we just naturally assume that the screens will control what you can do. And of course they do. The screens will actually put control over what you can see and do in the system. But you have to remember that Salesforce have something called a UI API, which means that you can take a record ID, you can probably second guess it if it's in the sequence. You can make a request to get that data, even as a portal user. You can do that. Likewise, if you're an API-enabled user, you know how to write some Java code. Even though your main UI might be all Lightning Web Component basis on hunky-dory, you can make an API call ultimately using SQL and Java, using REST API. All of a sudden, you can pull records down which you didn't think the user had access to. So this is one important thing I'll say, especially for people who are building very much custom stuff in Salesforce, custom UI, custom interface, etc. And this applies a lot to communities. If you are doing stuff using LWC in communities, then make sure that behind the scenes you've thought about the underlying sharing setup too, just to make sure that for things that should be locked down, you have locked them down properly, and for things that should be opened up, you've opened them up properly. So that's one thing I would say, and I'd say is never think that because my component doesn't show the data, it's safe and secure. May not necessarily be the case. So always design with the sharing and security principles in mind when setting up your data model. It goes back to that point again. So data model and sharing security, consider it all together, secure it in the way it should be secured, and then you don't have to worry about anybody building Apex, Lightning, data migration, external API. You just don't worry about it because you know that my heart is secure, so that anybody coming in will only be able to see what they can see, and that's really important.
I've seen this anti-pattern rather, when customers are trying to optimize on the licenses. When it comes to community, right? They want to use maybe a pool of 5 to 10 license and build a security layer using custom code, as you're saying, and that doesn't work.
Yeah, definitely. All right, I think we are getting close to the end of this particular session. Before we go, maybe let's touch this last hypothetical scenario, I would say. I'm sure, Mitesh, you would have been engaged on the programs where one particular partner was doing the implementation. It's a running org where multi-years, probably 10 years, that particular customer is on Salesforce. And then you get access to that particular org. So what are the different things you basically do to find out, okay, these are the security gaps which you would want to recommend to the customer, or these are the things which you want to look at?
Okay, so I think Salesforce has made part of this a bit easier as a starting point by being able to do health checks in the Salesforce org. So by doing health and security checks, it can tell you how many objects you've got as like publicly accessible and so on. So that's a good starting point to give you some kind of numbers. But if it was me, the kind of things I'd look at is from a org point of view, I'd firstly think, fine, how are they using profiles? Because Salesforce is now mandating the use of permission sets to grant access to people and what they can actually do in the org. So that's the first thing I'd check to find. What is the actual dynamic between profile and permission sets? And then secondly, has view all, modify all been overused anywhere? So that's the first thing I'd kind of have a look at and just understand, fine, is this actually correct or not? Has it been a box checked and left behind that no one's thought about? Or has it been thought about and how it's been set? That's probably the first thing I'd look at. The next thing I'd go into is then object by object, look at the org-wide defaults that have been set. Sometimes you'll find places where it's been made private, so it looks good. And then a nice sharing rule has been written, which opens it back up to everyone again. So it's worth keeping an eye out for those kind of behaviors too, just to make sure that, fine, anything that's there, be it an org-wide default or a sharing rule, is there because it should be there, and not something that's been left behind. Often what might happen is, because an org's built up over time, you might have a lot of sharing rules there. Some may be duplicates of another one. Some may be opening up to almost the same set of users anyways. So you want to keep an eye out for those and just make sure that if the duplicate's there, you at least identify them, so that in the next release or future releases, you can look to take those out as well. Another thing I'd have a look at is your Apex. So have a look at what Apex classes have been written without sharing. So in here, there can be two reasons. There might be a genuine reason for it to be without sharing. That's fine. I would still question it to understand why it's there. It may be okay. There may also be developer laziness, where they just thought, I couldn't get it working, so I just put it as without sharing. And I'm sure, I don't like saying this, but I'm sure people have done this in their time just to kind of get a ticket closed and get out the door. So it's worth looking at that too, just making sure that it's been set with reason as well. And once you've done that analysis, you can then work with the customer to say, right, let's look at your sharing model as well. Here's your objects. Here's your different user types. You tell me who should access what. And once you get to that detail, you can then say, right, this is actually what the optimal sharing setups should be. One last point I want to make is that when you're designing the sharing model, Salesforce have got a really excellent diagram that shows what questions you need to ask to determine what org-wide default should be set or not. So I think the essence of it was that if you have at least one user who should not have access to a record of data in that particular object, you then start having to look at going down a private model route. And this is the basic question you start with. And then from there, you can work down whether you're going to go public, read write, read only, private. But that basic question gets the fundamentals underway. So I'd always say to people, doing data model, I'd just ask that question, saying, and you can ask it in two forms. The first question should be, is there anyone who shouldn't have write access? Because then you still have the chance to do public read only. And then secondly, is there anybody who shouldn't have both read and write access to that particular, to a record, let's say. They should still be able to access record, but to a record. Then you have to think about going private. So that decision tree, it's so simple, but it's the most important one to remember when you're defining what the sharing setup should be in an org.
And when you do it as an afterthought, I think a lot of the code, a lot of automation that you write starts to break because of that, right? So
exactly.
it has to be done at the beginning. And these are some great pointers. What you just mentioned are like the 3 or 4 P0s that you'd look for by running a security scan, and then you need to have a plan to fix it. Like if you don't, because it's a data risk at the end of it, right? What with this whole AI thing, your data is your most important asset in your organization, right?
Exactly.
You want to protect that, and security is the tool to do that, right? So it's very rightly said, Mitesh. I think this has been a very fantastic episode. I feel like there are a lot of golden nuggets hidden in this episode, Mitesh. It was fantastic to meet you, have a chat with you, and thank you for sharing the knowledge. It shows that you have so much of experience on the platform, and you've done the work. You've put in your reps to actually be the expert on this platform. So anybody who's looking for the CTA, go on. What would be the best way to reach you, Mitesh? Would it be LinkedIn?
Either reach me on LinkedIn, or if you want to have a look at my coaching for CTA Academy, you can go to technocraftcloudservices.com. Bit of a mouthful, but technocraftcloudservices.com, and you can check the website there.
CTA folks, aspirational CTA folks, that's something that you should do. Hit up Mitesh as soon as you can, and let us know how you found this episode, and engage with us on giving us feedback on how we can improve our podcast going forward. Thank you, Mitesh.
Awesome.
Really have a good one.
Yeah, thank you guys for letting me take part, and have a good weekend.
You too. Thank you.
Awesome.
Well,
thank you. Bye.
Bye.
So with this amazing conversation, we conclude this episode, and thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we enjoyed recording it. We look forward to bringing more exciting and relevant content in the upcoming episodes.